Today we begin Homer. Oh, sorry. The Simpsons jokes are just too easy. Homer. And before we jump in, and it's a considerable jump into Homer, I just want to go over some of the basics. Some of the stuff that you have probably experienced having dipped your toe into the Homeric oeuvre and realized you have no idea what the hell is going on. It's weird. You've never quite read anything like Homer before. That said, has anybody read Homer before? High school? Okay. Some? Yeah. It's a sign of a good high school that still does that, to be perfectly honest, because it is becoming more and more rare. It used to be fairly standard. Did you read it in either poem? Did you read in like a full translation? Did you do excerpts? Did you do a modern translation? An older one? Did you do like a prose story, like a novelization of these things? Any idea?
I read a full version in school. I went to school, high school, and stuff.
Okay, well, that's good. Well, a long time ago. We're talking about
like
10 centuries or 10 millennium ago. For all not quite that long, but actually, yeah. There are a lot of different problems when confronting Homer, and some of them are meant to be problematic. And it's okay to be a little confused and lost. The important thing then is to ask, well, why am I confused or lost? Because it's not that you're not smart enough for this stuff. This is popular literature of the day, of sorts. It's just a matter of figuring out what's going on. And the rules are a little different than you might be used to. A couple of the basics. Basic background. Homer! No! About 8th century BCE, before Common Era. Way, way, way back. This is in Greece before it was Greece. It was just a rough geographic area populated with fairly diverse city-states, little communities, essentially tribal warlords ruling over different cities. It is a fairly barbaric time. Now, the time that Homer, and we're going to get to Homer, the time that these poems were written is not necessarily the time that these events happened. Homer is taking advantage of that age-old poetic device of casting a story long, long ago in a galaxy far, far away, just to make it a little bit abstracted from the current environment. You write about your friends and the people you know too much, and you get into trouble. So, cast it back a few thousand years or so, and it's easier to write. We don't know that much about the time we're dealing with. We have vague historical and archaeological evidence. Couple of years, a century or so ago, a German scholar decided that he would go and he would find the cities that Homer writes about in the Iliad and the Odyssey. Those are the two works that he's known for. And using clues based on what he finds in the poem, he went and he found, for from the Iliad. He found a location in modern Turkey that is largely thought to be Troy. There is evidence that at a certain time in history, a long, long time ago, the city was leveled completely. Sounds familiar. And he went and he found roughly similar evidence at certain points on the Greek mainland. They're a little less successful, but everything we know about this time period is fairly speculative. We have some artifacts, mainly war instruments, helmets, shields, some, weapons, which leads you to believe, and you wouldn't be wrong, that this is a fairly warlike society. I go back to my original characterization, tribal warlords. Whenever you see the word king in Homer, it can get confusing because there seem to be so many kings running around, and our idea of it is perhaps shaped by, the King of England, he's the king, and everybody else is beneath him. Well, no, there are many kings bumping up against one another, and that's part of the problem. They don't always get along. Too many cooks spoil a war. So these are not all-powerful kings. They are essentially local monarchs with very tight groups surrounding them, and they naturally come into conflict with other monarchs with tight groups around them. More about that soon. Anyway, when I say Homer, bear in mind that that's just sort of a little creativity on my part. Anyway, we have zero evidence of anyone named Homer. No birth certificate, driver's license, social security card, nothing. We only have legends. Homer himself may have been a composite of many people, over many centuries. There is a significant debate about the personality or authorship of Homer. Some people feel very passionately about this. I personally don't give a hot dookie. He could be one person, he could be a committee, he could be one person every 300 years sitting down and say, well, that guy had a good idea, let me just add to it. It just doesn't matter to me. Maybe it matters to you. God be with you. Go for it. For my purposes, Homer is just a handy way of describing the author. Homer is two syllables. The author is 3. So I'm going to go with Homer. Plus, as I said, it's fun to say. Homer! And of course, I go to 3 syllables when I add the no! Sorry, I'm going to keep doing that. More on that in a second. Quick note, this is an epic. Homer writes epic poems. The 2 that we have. He may have done other stuff on the side, who knows. You guys got to make a living. Epics are not novels. They're not movie scripts. You might be a little confused at times when you get in there and where'd the main character go? What's going on? I thought I was reading his story. No! An epic is larger than any one person. The story of an individual is different. Novels are a very recent artistic form, and they generally follow an individual, a protagonist, if you will, a hero. An epic is larger than that. An epic seeks to not tell the story of an individual, but very often an entire culture, an entire people, entire nation, something bigger than just one person. So, when, in the Iliad, for example, you start off strong following the story of Achilles, and then he just disappears for long, long stretches, and you're wondering what the hell's going on. They're following other people in this story of the founding of a civilization. Because remember, this is Homer writing about his own ancient past, imaginatively recreating how his people came to be. So it's not about one person. Gilgamesh is also an epic. A little shorter, a lot shorter than Homer, but it's about the founding of a civilization that we saw. This is roughly the same thing. There are all sorts of distinctions that you can always make. We don't need to make them. Who cares? You're not majoring in this. Let's move on. Oral composition. This is where it gets hairy. I forget the exact number of lines in this. Iliad and the Odyssey, I think, are each clocking in somewhere in the 15,000 line range, somewhere in there. It's quite a lot. There is significant evidence that this was orally composed, meaning no writing. The time that we believe it was composed, was actually a time when Greece was illiterate. It did not have writing. Fun fact, it had writing. It was the new fad for a while there, but it fell out of fashion. People didn't really like to read, and they largely couldn't. So it just sort of went away for a few centuries. Fashions. But then it came back. But in that little space between, you had the Iliad and the Odyssey pop up. Now, this seems incredible. This seems impossible. Flip through all of those lines. Who the hell can remember that? I can't remember anything. What was I saying? See? But if you look at the patterns of how it is written, it's actually engineered for this. It might be hard to believe that somebody could remember all this, but I'll bet if you put on, certain soundtracks, you can sing along to an awful lot of songs. And you'll know every word, every pause in those words. Maybe it adds up to roughly equivalent of the Iliad or the Odyssey. Maybe it doesn't. But you know a lot of words. Why? You know them. I'm going to assume everybody here has listened to music at some point in the last 20 years. Going out on a wild limb there. What do songs do that make them easy to remember the words? And now, of course, we're all imagining all those times that are embarrassing when singers forget their words. What's in it? They rhyme. Yeah. Rhyme helps you remember. Because the minute you say one word at the end of a line, usually, it sort of triggers okay, I know that next one is coming up. And everything fits into a nice, neat pattern. The mind conceives on patterns. It's chaos that we just can't handle. You can't memorize a short story, but a poem, bam, there you go. And a poem is really just a song. We can go into that. Started off as being performances where you have a little lyre, and you play, and somebody sings along. That's roughly what we're talking about here. The Greeks did not really have rhyme. Rhyme is, again, a relatively recent tool in that. The Greeks did have rhythm, which, in translation, is kind of lost to us. We don't have that. I highly recommend anybody who wants to. There are videos on YouTube of people reciting this, sometimes like in the middle of a Greek theater, like perhaps the ancient Greeks would have, in the original Greek, which is not like the modern Greek, but you know, it has some similarities. And you can start to hear rhythm. They play with it a little differently. It's more of a stress on pauses than on the strict syncopation that we tend to lean on in English. But yeah. What else in songs makes them easier to remember? Repetition! Yeah. A song, your average song, is based on, you know, a lyric, a chorus, a lyric, a chorus, a familiar pattern, a bridge, a lyric, a chorus. Something like that. I don't know. But, yeah, that's another pattern. It sets itself up in the mind. And at certain points, if anybody's ever done karaoke, you can get into a chorus and you have no idea what's coming after that. But while you're in that chorus, you can just sort of like mentally check out and just go along with the chorus because everybody knows those words while you're struggling, dying to know, all right, now, where am I going after this? What's the next thing? Oh, yeah. And then just as you hit it, of course, it comes through. Unless you're me and you just totally humiliate yourself. Oh, karaoke. It's vicious. The Greeks are doing that too. So after that, it's just a matter of scale. Once you have a basic idea of the tools that they're working with, it's just a matter of, well, okay, they just did it more. And you know, in a not quite pre-literate society, but in an illiterate society, let's say, a non-literate society, there was no writing down, so you look for ways to remember things. Poetry is one of those ways. Believe it or not, in the ancient world, you get an awful lot of poems about farming. You know, you got to remember this stuff. How do you take care of a cow? You get a poem about that. How do you take care of bees to get honey? You get poems about that. It's a way of remembering information. This also is a hotly debated conflict in the area of Homeric studies. It's largely centered around one figure these days, well, actually a couple of guys, from the early 20th century. This guy, for a long time, it was supposed that, well, no, the whole oral composition thing, that's all just a legend. Somebody wrote this down, and there are all sorts of traditions about that. Some guy in the early 20th centuries, there was only one 20th century, went and noticed some of these patterns. And he saw that it was similar to certain oral storytelling traditions alive in Eastern Europe. So he traveled to Eastern Europe in like the 20s or something like that, and started interviewing and documenting the work of these oral poets who could remember vast swaths of poetry, huge, long stories that they remembered exactly every time. And he started to draw the connection. Well, okay, what are they doing that makes this possible? Because it's one thing to just say, well, you know, back then, those people were just, they had more brain power. We've gotten stupider over the ages. But if you can find someone walking around in the 20th century that does something roughly similar, that's impressive, that's important. And that's what he did. And he started looking around through Homer to find parallels to what these guys were doing in Eastern Europe. And he started to see that, well, the stories themselves were perhaps written down at some point. We don't know exactly how. Maybe they were orally recited for, a few centuries here or there. And at that point, somebody actually wrote it down. That comes under a lot of mockery sometimes, where I think the classic joke is, you get an oral poet or an oral singer, as they're called, a bard, reciting some grand line, usually the first line from Homer, and then just looking over at his secretary and saying, "You got that?" It's a funny joke if you get it. But this controversy has gone on based on this. It's come under some attack, some people saying, well, this makes it sound like they're just mixing around different cliches, different patterns, and there wasn't so much artistry in it, and it was almost accidental. Because one of the contentions that this theory came up with is that certain words and phrases are used that are just stock phrases that they could slap in there, like a chorus in a song, that buys them a little time while they think up what is coming next. And this accounts for a lot of the repetition that we see, specifically in the area of epithets. Epithets are those little descriptive words, adjectives roughly, functionally, that you find endlessly attached to certain people or certain things. How many times you must be pulling your hair out when you're reading the Iliad and you come across swift-footed Achilles. Like, all right, I get it, he can run. Why are we belaboring this point? It's annoying, the repetition. The theory of the oral composition tells us that, well, basically, because of rhythm, you need to be able to fit certain things in certain lines in certain ways, so you bend the language to do what you need. But it also buys you that time and allows you to think for that split second. Critics of that will tell you that, well, that does make it sound like he's just sort of hashing together chunks of other stuff, and he's not really doing anything, and it's almost arbitrary. I had a professor once who would point out that, well, another one that is very common, especially in the Iliad, is the epithet swift ships. The ships are very swift, always. And this would, under the oral composition theory that this guy laid out, it would seem like, well, this is just about trying to make it fit into a line. And this professor I had would point out that, well, no, that's sort of denigrating the artistry we see here, because in fact what you have when you see swift ships is an example of irony, of things not being the way they seem. Because in the Iliad, as everybody who's read the beginning knows, these ships are not that swift at this point. At the beginning of the Iliad, they have been beached for a decade. They've been just sitting there on the beach. They're not racing anywhere. Irony. I would say that swift-footed Achilles falls into this same category, since for a big chunk of the poem, the whole problem is he's just kind of sitting on his ass. He's not doing anything. Swift-footed Achilles is kicking back. But pokey Achilles doesn't really, carry much oomph. So these are problems of this poem, these poems, that you have to bear in mind. It's not familiar. But who wants to read stuff that's familiar all the time? You don't challenge yourself, you never grow. Diapers were familiar to me up until a few years ago. Now I'm a big boy. For at least another couple of years, and then we all know what happens. Anyway, a couple other terms. The values that we find in these poems are also somewhat foreign, somewhat difficult to imagine from the modern age. Not entirely, but there's an emphasis on them that is perhaps peculiar. Whenever something is peculiar when you're reading, just, have the confidence to say, that's peculiar. Why? What does that oddity tell me? You're allowed to judge people. It's fun. Judge these books as they come at you. One of the weirdest concepts for modern people is Zendaya, which in Greek means hospitality. Xenia is bizarre for modern people. Xenia means that in the Greek world, you were expected to welcome guests. Guests are very privileged. If somebody comes to your door, you open the door. Before you say anything else, come on in, sit down. We're just about to serve dinner. You sit here at the head of the table, right next to the big guy. We're gonna have some entertainment soon. We're gonna fill up your wine glass. We're gonna relax. Would you like a bath? We have some hot water. We've got some slave girls to give you that bath. It's good to be the king. Sit down, relax, enjoy the evening with us. And after a few hours of this, you can tell us who you are and what you want. But we won't ask before that. It was great to be a UPS guy in ancient Greece. This was the life. It's a little bizarre. Why would they do that? You don't have to answer that now. We will get to that. Hubris, excessive pride. Some of these people seem like real tools. They are bragging constantly. They are wildly overconfident. Hey, guys. Watch what happens to people who demonstrate excessive pride. Spoiler alert, it doesn't end well for them. We'll get to that. KLEOS, fame and or glory. This is probably the easiest one for modern people to understand. Who doesn't want to be famous? Who doesn't want to walk the red carpet, have everybody take pictures? The entire reality TV industry is built on this. But it goes even beyond that in the Greek world because, as we have seen in the ancient world, i.e. Gilgamesh, fame is a kind of immortality. That glory is very, very important. Little lesser known, AIDOS. Everybody knows about hubris. AIDOS is social connection. This is, again, a tribal society. There are essentially gangs wandering around. they are enormously connected to one another, only fractiously connected between tribes. The idea of Greece did not exist. One of the things that's very difficult to follow in this is the word Greece is very loosely translated as like a dozen different words. They are Hellenes, they're Achaeans, they're all of these different things, and then they get down to like actual city-states, and that's really where their identity lies, and it's just confusing. Greek, there was no Greek nation. It was a loose cultural connection among very disparate city-states, tribes, a confederacy of gangs, if you will. Connected to that, the term Eris, which is sometimes translated in a bit of an old-fashioned way as strife. I think that's the one that this translation uses. Strife or contention, but it's just it's not getting along on an interpersonal, person-to-person scale, and also in the way that, you know, armies and cities don't get along, both among tribes and, you know, in the case of the Iliad, Troy and Greece, Eris. A predisposition to fight. English words that are too difficult to really translate but are crucial. Fate. Fate is very important, especially in a storytelling mode. You will be going along. What's this story about? What's this story about? And suddenly the narrator will just tell you how it all turns out. You know? At the end of the Iliad, Troy falls. At the end of the Odyssey, Odysseus comes home. And you're learning this on like page 2. Like, well, what's the point now? Spoiler alert! Oh, I'm done. I don't have to read anymore. There's no suspense. Suspense didn't really exist for the Greeks. It wasn't necessarily their thing. Fate was fixed. Fate tells you what will happen at the end. The mystery comes out in finding out exactly how it will come about. You know where it's going to end. You don't know exactly how. It doesn't take much to make that mental leap to see how fate mirrors death itself. We're all going to die. It's a question of how. The details matter. And also moderation. Moderation, we can see tied into hubris, suggests that the Greeks were oddly prurient, is a good word, I guess, that nobody probably knows. Moderation in all things is a very Greek way of looking at things. Not too much, not too little, just enough, you know? The 2-drink evening. You're not going to be a stick in the mud and say, no, nothing. But on the other hand, you're not going to get sloppy drunk. 2 drinks. Moderation. Don't go crazy. Keep your wits about you. Keep your head about you. Don't give in to anger, passion of any kind. Think things through. Because consequences are important. Because even if you know how the story is going to end, there are a lot of different permutations along the way that can mean the difference between a good end and a bad end. This is the Greek way of looking at things. And this is really important to understanding.